Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. You can follow me on X Twitter at Movies TV Mad and on Instagram and on Threads at Movies TV Mad X. A very warm welcome to the Movies TV Mad Daily. Today we are asking why Man of Steel didn't make $1 billion. And there's some core reasons for this. There's this weird situation that's always been going around. A misinterpretation that Zack Snyder is to blame for the things that people didn't like about Man of Steel. Zack Snyder was never in charge of the Man of Steel movie. Nolan put him in charge of the visual narrative. But really, the man who was in charge of the story of Man of Steel was David S. Goyer, the man who co-penned the Dark Knight trilogy with Christopher Nolan. Christopher Nolan and David Goyer wrote the Man of Steel story together, but Goyer penned the screenplay on his own. In fact, we all know the story, don't we? While he had writer's block during The Dark Knight Rises, he came up with an alien invasion story, a first contact story for a Superman film, which would be called Man of Steel. The reason Man of Steel is called Man of Steel, because originally the Superman Returns sequel was going to be titled Superman, Man of Steel. They cut the Superman bit out. They wanted to call it Man of Steel. I love Man of Steel. I've discussed this before many times. It's a wonderful, beautifully constructed, contemporary Superman story in a post 9/11 world. And I get what Goyer's idea was here. It was supposed to be more hard-hitting. It was supposed to be more, it had more realism to it. It's very different to Superman 78. So if we go to the beginning of this film, on Krypton, I don't think there's anything wrong with what happens on Krypton. Krypton looks stunning. It's amazing. Now, obviously, they wanted to create differences between Man of Steel and Superman 78. So as Jor-El is sending Kal-El off, he doesn't make the big monologue that Brando makes in the first film. I kind of feel that may have been a slight mistake, but not a deal breaker to any fans. It wasn't a deal breaker for me. You know, goodbye, my son. Our hopes and dreams travel with you. But I do feel we could have had a little bit more there. But it wasn't a deal breaker for anyone. It wasn't a criticism. And they were just trying to make some differences between Superman 78 and Man of Steel. But then they do something quite surprising as I'm watching this in the cinema for the first time. And the fact is, although he lands in Kansas, we don't see him in Kansas as young Clark Kent. After the Krypton sequence, we see him on this big boat, and there's this fire and there's these explosions, and Clark Kent's got a beard, and it's very, very different. He's been traveling the world. He's been trying to find answers about his Kryptonian heritage. So it's very, very different. Again, nothing wrong with this. The Smallville sequences were used in the editing as flashbacks. And again, it works. Nothing wrong with this. As we meet Jonathan Kent, I think hardcore Superman fans started to have problems, and so did the mainstream. And when Clark saves the kids on the bus and, you know, Jonathan's telling him off for doing so, you know, Clark's going, what did you expect me to do? Let them die? Jonathan says maybe. We see this in the opening trailer, and already people are saying, Pa Kent would never say this. Now, we understand what Goyer is attempting to do here. He's saying, you know, you can't just do it. You've got to be careful. We get it in the context. It's the way he says maybe. In other words, maybe you should have let them die. Again, this was a deal breaker for a lot of people. So then we've got the tornado sequence where Jonathan Kent goes back for the dog. Again, people didn't like the fact that Jonathan went back for the dog. There's no dog family that wouldn't go back for their dog. We know that. But people started to question and criticize. You see, what you do here, you give people who are looking to criticize something an excuse. And there was many Marvel fans and other people who hated Snyder who mistakenly misinterpreted and misunderstood that Snyder was making these decisions. Snyder was not in charge of Man of Steel. He was in charge of the visual narrative because he can create a stunning movie, which he did. But he wasn't in charge of the movie. Let's be clear. He was in charge of Man of Steel because Man of Steel didn't make $1 billion. Now, we'll get to Batman versus Superman and how that hurt things even more. Even again, I love Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice. So then you've got the incident where the tornado is approaching Jonathan Kent, but he puts his hand out and doesn't let Clark save him. Clark stands there and allows his father to die out of respect for his wishes. It's very compelling, and I get it. And I personally am okay with it. But again, the audiences didn't like it because they know this is out of character for Superman and Clark Kent. There's no way he would have stood there in the Smallville TV show and allowed his father to die, or in Christopher Reeve's version, or Dean Cain's version, or any other version, right? So again, this way that he dies is different, it's interesting, and it's trying to use this core story about the world not being ready for Clark to reveal himself. And again, I like it, it's interesting, but the way it was executed posed questions and upset audiences. As we get into the film, there's no Clark Kent in the Daily Planet to the end of the movie. One of the core things that people love about a Superman story is Clark, Lois, and the banter at the Daily Planet. We've got Lois at the Daily Planet, we've got Perry at the Daily Planet, we don't have a Jimmy Olsen, by the way, at the Daily Planet, something people didn't like. Now, they had this Jenny character who was rumoured to be Jenny Olsen. They never called her Jenny Olsen in the end. A perfectly fine character played by a perfectly fine actor. The problem is she doesn't even have the personality of Jimmy Olsen. She doesn't really do much within the film. And in the end, you kind of think to yourself, yeah, she's cool, but what's the point of her? You've replaced Jimmy Olsen with this character for no reason. It doesn't make sense. Now, there was controversy over Larry Fishburne playing Perry White because of the colour of his skin. And I said at the time, if they just cast a random black guy who couldn't act instead of a white guy that could act, I'd have a problem. But Larry Fishburne is one of the great Hollywood actors, right? I've been watching him since I was a kid. I thought it was fantastic casting. I didn't have an issue, and I didn't feel it was a deal breaker, and this didn't cost the film $1 billion. As Superman starts fighting Zod, destruction starts to happen. Like the moment I loved, you think you can threaten my mother, that's great, but then they crash into the petrol station. Superman doesn't seem that bothered that this petrol station has exploded. There's cars parked there. Surely people have died because Superman and Zod have crashed into the petrol station. Again, this was a deal breaker for people watching the film. These are things that could have been sorted out. But unfortunately, Goya was so bloody minded. And don't get me wrong, Goya's a great writer. He did a great job with the Dark Knight trilogy. I think he's a very good storyteller. I think he's personally a genius. A lot of people don't like him. I think he did a lot of things right, but he was too bloody minded. Like, he hated kryptonite. He said it's a stupid, dumb green rock. I don't want to use it. Well, that's the thing that creates a weakness for Superman, an all-powerful alien. Kryptonite is a good thing. Kryptonite, I love the fact that Smallville made Kryptonite a character in the show. I thought that was genius. So there was that. So you've got the destruction. You're clearly seeing people dying, and the explanation, justification is, well, Superman can't be everywhere, which is true. But hardcore Superman fans and general audiences didn't want to see this. And then you've got the core problem of Man of Steel for a lot of audiences. Personally, I love the film. I can look past these issues, and I think they kind of work in a way with the kind of story that they wanted to tell. But there were issues. And I think the core issue why the film didn't make $1 billion is Superman breaking Zod's neck. Now, within the narrative, Superman has no choice. He chooses humanity over the Kryptonian, which is the right decision to make. But Goya didn't have to take the story that way. When people debate this and people defend it, oh, he had no choice. Yes, he had no choice. But it should never have been constructed that way, because Zod should never have been killed off in Man of Steel. Michael Shannon as General Zod may be the best villain in comic book movie history. When I think about the 4 Superman films, when I think about Superman Returns, when I think about all these superhero movies, people go on about Thanos, who is okay, but I've never rated him that high. I think people go over the top about Thanos. Ledger's Joker is sensational. I think Liam Neeson is a great baddie in Batman Begins. There's a lot of great I'm a big fan of Batman Returns. I think the villains were, done so well. It's one of my favourite Batman movies. But I don't think there's a better supervillain than General Zod. And you do not kill someone that good off. And these are the core problems why Man of Steel didn't make $1 billion. Now, I've explained to you before how I would have ended Man of Steel. Man of Steel would have been left on a cliffhanger for me. I've kind of adjusted my idea now. Superman gets banished to the Phantom Zone, while Zod and the Kryptonians take over Earth. Superman did thwart the world engine, as he does in the film, but they're now in control of Earth. And without Superman to save humanity, basically, humanity is enslaved by the Kryptonians. So the sequel to Man of Steel has Superman trapped, trapped in the Phantom Zone. And maybe a couple of, maybe kind of, like the Colonel, maybe trapped with the Colonel and that doctor guy, and they're there and he's trying to, maybe I don't know if I would have Lois in the Phantom Zone or if I'd keep her on Earth. And that will be an interesting thing. So it'd be a big cliffhanger. Superman is trapped in the Phantom Zone and Zod and the Kryptonians are now basically ruling the Earth with an iron fist. And I think that would have been a very, very interesting sequel. So I think killing Zod, how do you kill him? There was no need to kill Zod, a very valuable villain, because we can see from the Flash movie that Shannon was willing to reprise the character. So there wasn't an issue with Shannon saying, I won't do this. He asked Zack Snyder's permission if it was okay with him. We heard from Shannon. That was very brilliant and respectful by Michael. And you don't kill off a character like that, a valuable character. You don't kill off your best characters. You could have had, as I say, a great cliffhanger. And because of these core reasons, and maybe I've missed out other core reasons as well, I don't think the Lois Clark Superman dynamic was done right. They skipped past it. It was all right, but they skipped past it. They weren't interested in spending much time on that love story, right? They didn't really want to deal with that. They wanted Lois to be a strong, independent woman and part of Superman's adventure. And I think they did that part really, really well. But they didn't really want to focus on the love story. You've got to give them credit that they developed the love story so quickly and fast, because all they care about is the action and the fast-pacedness of the movie. That's why Clark isn't at the Daily Planet, because that would slow things down. So they didn't want to do that. But I think what I've catalogued here, and for me, none of these things are deal breakers. I saw Man of Steel multiple of times in cinemas, loved it each time more than the last. It's an amazing film. It truly is. I think after the third act battle, they do make some little mistakes. I think he's kind of hot. Yeah, I think that was ill-advised as well. But again, not a deal breaker for people. But ultimately, if you smooth out certain issues with Man of Steel that people had, the Man of Steel makes $1 billion at the global box office. And if Man of Steel makes $1 billion at the global box office, then Goya and Nolan are running the DCEU while Snyder directs their movies. Now, this is the core problem that destroyed the DCEU. They blamed Goya directly for Man of Steel not making $1 billion. So the studio, not Snyder, decided they wanted a Batman and Superman movie. They thought it was easy money, a bit like Deadpool and Wolverine. Bring back Logan, easy money. Over $1 billion in the bank, it's coming, it's happening. Deadpool and Wolverine isn't the greatest of movie. It's just cameo and nostalgia porn, but it doesn't matter. That's what people want today, which to me is very sad for modern cinema, but this is where we are. So they thought introducing Batman would just make them some easy, quick money. And it nearly did. They had one of the biggest record-breaking openings for BVS ever. But the film was too controversial. In fact, everything that people didn't like about Man of Steel, Snyder doubled down on even more. So instead of having Superman killing this time, he had Batman killing this time. Again, I respect each director's and writer's, vision. So even though Batman has, like Superman, has a no-kill policy, I love Batman versus Superman. I'm happy to let it go. But in terms of making money and creating a successful franchise, the elements that I've pointed out about Man of Steel and the issues with Batman versus Superman is the reason the DCEU failed. Once Goya's out, Nolan's out. Yeah, they're producers, right? And Goya's even credited as one of the writers. He wrote a script for Man of Steel 2. That's why he's credited. He had nothing to do with Batman versus Superman. Nolan is credited as an executive producer, as his good wife, Emma Thomas is. But again, Nolan and Thomas had nothing to do with Batman versus Superman. So because of the issues with Man of Steel, because it didn't make the $1 billion they wanted, Goya and Nolan are out and Snyder is running things. Now, Snyder is a great director as far as I'm concerned. He's not really a writer. He's not really a story constructor. If we had Goya and Nolan making multiple DCEU movies with Snyder just being in charge of the visual narrative, we would have had a very successful DC Extended Universe, because Man of Steel is a very, very good film. And many people who don't even like BVS love Man of Steel. As I've already said, Man of Steel is a great contemporary Superman movie with one of the best versions of the characters playing him. Henry Cavill was a great Superman. Amy Adams is a great actor, a great Lois Lane. Larry Fishburne, a great Perry White. If they just didn't make the mistakes, when you're making Superman, you can't just have your own artistic integrity. It can be there, but you've got to think about the general audience. You've got to think about who's going to come and who's not going to come. Once you've got the line, are we going to stop measuring dicks? Basically, parents are going to say, I can't take my kids to this. Once Superman breaks Zod's neck so violently, basically, parents are not going to allow their kids to come back and watch it. And I know some of you are going to go, well, I took my kids back. Yeah, but it wasn't done generally. That's my point. Gunn's movie will be more friendly, will be more family friendly, because they understand where the money is. That's where the MCU money used to be when the MCU was successful. So at the end of the day, the reasons for Man of Steel failing, and Man of Steel, now to me, nearly 700 million, isn't a failure, but to the studio, they wanted more. They added Batman for this core reason, and it could have been successful, but Snyder went down a very different tunnel. And I mean, the studio didn't blame Snyder for Man of Steel because he wasn't really in charge of Man of Steel. Goya was. And Nolan supported Goya's vision because they're friends, right? And they work together so well with the Dark Knight trilogy. So these are the core reasons why the DCEU failed, but Man of Steel didn't make $1 billion. Because if Man of Steel makes $1 billion, there's no Batman versus Superman, you get a quick Man of Steel sequel continuing. Because I'm sure Goya kind of would have continued Man of Steel in a certain way. And of course, BVS does show you a kind of prequel of Man of Steel connecting to BVS. So it is a sequel, and I like what they did there, but ultimately, Goya had a very, very different idea. And I've said from the beginning, as much as I love Snyder, and Snyder's visual narrative of the DCEU, this was where it went wrong. Nolan was obviously attached to Man of Steel because of Goya being involved. He backed Goya wanting to write this film, and Goya dragged Nolan along with him. Nolan should have directed Man of Steel. He says he didn't have the visual directing ability to do it. But when you see what he did in Oppenheimer, when you see what he does, he would have had the capability. This is a man who was obsessed with Dick Donner and what he did with Superman 78. In fact, Batman Begins is made purposefully the same kind of way as Superman 78 is. Theatrical actors, from the theatre, and, the way it was done, and Michael Caine, and all of that. Christian Bale, a proper actor playing Bruce Wayne and Batman. So, I think if Nolan had directed, because it's a shame, Snyder's perfect to direct comic book movies as long as there's someone there in charge of him narratively. Someone where Zack isn't in charge of the story, just the visual story. Man of Steel visually, the visual narrative is down to Snyder. It's stunning, it's brilliant, it works, it's contemporary. But you've got to have someone there to stop Snyder. Snyder shouldn't be in charge of a Batman movie or a Superman movie. Even though I think BVS is a great movie, ultimately you ruin your chance to make bank with the way Snyder tells these stories. Again, I love the guy. I'm not criticizing him. Everyone should be free to be the people they want to be. You can't change. But the reason WB own DC and own Batman and own Superman, because it's supposed to be a profitable commodity. They're not doing it out of love for DC or love for Superman or Batman. And that's something that people need to understand as well. And if Goya and Nolan stayed and Man of Steel made $1 billion, the DCEU would still be running today. I think Goya and Nolan would have done a certain part, told their story, then they would have moved on maybe, and maybe someone else could have come on board. I don't know. All I know is if Man of Steel made $1 billion, the DCEU would have went along the same direction of Goya, Nolan and Snyder working together. And as we saw from Man of Steel, this was the perfect storm. But when you're making a Superman movie, there's certain things you cannot do. There's certain things you must do. And we've seen this, not just with Man of Steel, we've seen this with Superman Returns, where Singer wants to continue Superman 2 and continue the Reeve-Donner verse. So the problem with it, he makes mistakes. The Lois Lane he casts is nothing like Margot Kidder, right? The guy he casts as Perry White is nothing like, in personality form, as the Jackie Cooper. The world he builds, the Daily Planet building, looks nothing like Christopher Reeve's Daily Planet. Nothing feels like it's continuing. And the editing and losing the Return to Krypton sequence, lots of mistakes. You've got to understand what it takes to make a successful Superman movie. The reason these Superman movies haven't hit the heights, and again, I think Man of Steel is a great movie, and I think Superman Returns is a movie with so many great moments, maybe not necessarily a great movie, but it's got great memories, it's got great moments, and Singer almost got it right. And he was nearly allowed to make a sequel, I believe, that would have fixed the problems of Superman Returns. But if you keep on having problems and having to fix those problems, it becomes a problem. DCEU was exactly that. People had issues with Man of Steel. People had even more issues with BVS. Then Snyder's making Justice League. Then he's out as the director of Justice League. We finally get his Justice League. Then we get Hamada, and we get Bergs and John. Bergs and John don't have a vision. They're just trying to brighten up the universe and solve the criticisms against the DCEU. And Hamada's just there. Hamada did have a vision, but his vision was to make cheap movies and replace Superman with Supergirl and replace Batman with Batgirl. Batgirl's got to be standing with Batman. Supergirl has got to be standing with Superman. Even James Gunn recognises that. And this is what we're getting now. We're getting Supergirl. Now, if Supergirl replaces Superman, and Superman dies at the end of this Superman movie, I won't be happy and I won't support James Gunn's vision and I won't support the DC universe any longer. But we'll have to wait and see. He says that's not going to happen. We're going to have to trust him and find out what happens in this movie. But we wouldn't have a James Gunn DCU now if only they put their ego away. If David Goyer put his ego away and just didn't do certain things with Man of Steel, I could have lived without Superman breaking Zod's neck. I'm sure most of you could have. The destruction. Because I was thinking about Superman 2, that also has a lot of destruction in the middle of Metropolis. But no one's killed, you can see that. And when Superman comes up from under the bus, he lures them to the Fortress of Solitude purposely to keep the public safe. It was clever to do that at the time. But these were the core issues with Man of Steel. Again, I'll be clear. These are not my issues. These were general issues of the general audience and hardcore Superman fans. And you can understand where they're coming from. That they don't want Superman to kill. They want Superman to be looking at this destruction and fucking hell. Now, Superman does save some people in the movie. But people are dying everywhere. And that isn't the reason Superman was created. Superman needs to save the day. Superman shouldn't kill because people don't want him to kill. Because mostly he hasn't killed. And people can bring up moments where maybe he has or accidentally, people have died, whatever. At the end of the day, I believe that people generally liked Man of Steel but had core issues with it. There's one YouTuber that always says, Man of Steel is a good movie, but it's not a good Superman movie. And that, my friends, is an interesting distinction. Now, I wouldn't go as far to say that Man of Steel isn't a good Superman movie, but I understand what this guy was saying, right? I think it's Jeremy from Geeks and Gamers. And I think he makes a valid point. Although I love Man of Steel and I think it's a great modern day, contemporary Superman movie. And it's a shame because you know why? They almost got it right. Almost got it right. If they didn't do some of the things that I've underlined, this film makes $1 billion. And Goyer, Nolan and Snyder carry on. And they make a successful DC Extended Universe. And they make something that's quite refreshing and different to counter the MCU. I truly believe that. The Snyderverse was an exciting time. Man of Steel, BVS, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, and Zack Snyder's Justice League, another great movie. But at the end of the day, I believe if Goyer just put his ego away with certain situations with Man of Steel, the film definitely makes around $1 billion or just under $1 billion, and then the studio doesn't panic, doesn't automatically force Batman into a Batman and Superman movie, right? And it takes its time, it breathes, and it becomes something interesting. Goyer, Nolan, and Snyder directing, instead of allowing Snyder to be totally in charge. Even though I love BVS and I love the Snyder Cut. But they're not for everyone. And that's the point. Superman and Batman must be for everyone. DC must be for everyone. Why? Because, as I said, these IPs are owned because there's money potential. There's fiscal potential. They're not there for artistic integrity. They're not there for any other reason but to make the studio money. And there's certain things you cannot do with these characters where it's crossing a line and audiences turn their backs on you, ultimately. But also ultimately, Snyder's movies made more, apart from one movie after Snyder left, which was Aquaman. And I mean, Wonder Woman made a lot of money, but Snyder was heavily involved with Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman wouldn't have been the great movie it was without Zack Snyder. So I have a lot of respect for him and what he did with the DCEU. But ultimately, if they made the right decisions with Man of Steel, the DCEU would have been very successful. And James Gunn, right now, wouldn't be anywhere near DC.